Hello everyone, in this video on my whiteboard we're going to cover a couple of things about the glute max specifically and how oftentimes the two-dimensional representations that we see in textbooks can create enormous amounts of confusion in application, meaning in resistance training when we're trying to train this thing. So this represents a pelvis, the bottom of the lumbar spine, and then the hip socket and the actual femur, right? So if I have my pelvis model here, this is kind of the perspective that I'm holding it up at or that I'm drawing it at, and there's the femur. Okay, so that's what that's supposed to represent. Now this is the view that 99.9 repeating percent of textbooks will show you when they represent what a glute max looks like. So normally the way that they draw the fibers is from all these different attachment sites like this, right? So the glute max, for those of you who don't know, has attachment sites all along the back half of this innominate bone, right? That what's called the ilium and the iliac crest, and then it runs down all the way down through the sacrum, which is this tailbone thing that's over here, and to the coccyx, which is essentially the bottom tip of the tailbone, right? And so this is what, to most people, the glute max looks like. And so what you'll notice is that all of the fibers from this perspective appear to be running in this horizontal direction. So naturally, any innocent person who is attempting to learn anatomy for the first time looks at this and understands the basic concept that, like, okay, muscles contract and they pull point A to point B. And so when these things move closer, what will happen and what will ensue as a consequence is my leg will externally rotate like so, right? It'll go from this neutral position to, boom, this position. But what this doesn't account for is every other one of the potentially infinite number of positions that we could be in a resistance training setting or in real life that have nothing to do with you just standing up. Answer this. How many times do you go into the gym and stand up and load your glute max like this, where you stand up and you maybe put a cable or something around your leg and you just rotate it like this? Right? Like if that was all there was to it, then we would have a pretty easy, simple life as trainers, as coaches, and as people who are attempting to understand anatomy. But unless you're in this one specific position, and that's the only position that you're going to train this muscle in, that external rotation function becomes a very sort of small piece to the puzzle when it comes to actually understanding the glutes. So let's look at scenario 2. And I'm going to move over here. And now we're going to pretend that instead of the pelvis being this way, right, the pelvis is this way. So we're looking at it from the side. And because I'm terrible at drawing these kinds of things, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use it to kind of serve as an outline for the hips, okay? It'll be awful, but it'll be better than nothing, okay? So here's the lumbar spine like that, okay? And here's something like a hip. Here's a hip socket. And then here's that femur going downward, all right? Now all of a sudden, just with one other perspective, we look at this thing and we can kind of get a better idea of how this thing and how these fibers orient from this perspective. And now all of a sudden you're thinking, well, in the first instance where these fibers just wanted to sort of externally rotate the femur, now all of a sudden from the side, and especially as you can imagine as this leg comes up in front of the body over here, these fibers, right, would sort of wrap underneath of the femur like this and pull the leg. If I'll just erase this so as to not muddy the water. Now they would pull the leg in this position downward like this, right, because they're wrapping underneath of the pelvis. And so from one perspective, yeah, sure, they externally rotate, no problem. But from any other perspective, especially when the leg is up in front of the body, as in a leg press, as in a lunge, whether forward or backward, as in something like a step down or a glute bridge, a big part of this function in terms of differentiating these two of the glute max is to pull the leg downward. So what you end up with when you only look at one perspective of this whole anatomy picture is you end up doing exercises that in terms of the total net function of this thing are really not super specific to that muscle, right? Because muscle recruitment is really a consequence of not just one muscle in a single position in isolation. It's a consequence of all the other muscles that have the potential to contribute with lower energy demands. So for example, in this position here, we have to consider the fact that there are other muscles, for example, like the piriformis, like all of the posterior rotators, the gemelli, the obturator internus and externus, right? All those tiny muscles have a really, really strong ability just to perform that external rotation because that's really their only function. The glute max, because it wants to do so many other things, i.e. hip extension, pulling the leg downward from this perspective, if you were to only isolate its only isolate its external rotation function, as in this image, you would be missing a large part of what the glute max actually does in terms of what its abilities are and what it has the capacity to do. So a good sort of framing to keep in mind whenever we're trying to understand anatomy and how we can apply it to the gym is not just a single perspective, and these are only two, right? But even just with one additional one, we gain this whole different perspective through which we can understand function. So for example, whenever we're doing some kind of leg pressy thing, right, where my femur, imagine leg pressing, right? Maybe I'm in a leg press this way and my femur is going like this. If my femur is going like this in a leg press, my glutes are doing tons and tons of work, right? Especially because the knee is in motion because we can pull the leg so high, right? And so does that mean that external rotation is not a function of the glute max? Absolutely not. It absolutely is, specifically more so the upper fibers, I would say, than the lower fibers. But what that means is that the glute max, when it contracts, is going to do all of these things at once, right? Muscles don't just pick and choose, okay, am I going to externally rotate? Am I going to extend, right? Your biceps, for example, are a good muscle to illustrate this point, where your biceps technically can perform any one of three different functions, right? They can supinate the wrist, they can turn the palm up, they can bend the elbow, and then to a very small degree, they can act to move the shoulder forward. So would you want to just isolate one of those functions? Potentially, right? But you would want to isolate the one that gives you the most bang for your buck in terms of total length change of the muscle and its total contribution. And so something like this plays a much bigger role than something like this in the context of glute max, where we're actually doing this, right? So again, although, yeah, I'm extending and then also sort of externally rotating in tandem with that, we have to consider the fact that in resistance training, we can only really act against one direction, right? One effective direction of resistance. At least in any sort of productive exercise. So when we're thinking about, okay, how do we apply anatomy to exercise, we need to think beyond the scope of a single position, and we need to conceptualize each and every muscle, not only in the context of the various positions that muscle can be, we'll say, biased in, or more stretched in, or more shortened in, but also in terms of all the other muscles that do similar things. So on the flip side here, where we looked at, okay, there are a ton of other muscles that externally rotate to be able to perform this function, what other muscles really perform hip extension in the context of something like a leg press or a hack squat, right? Not a lot of other muscles. Really the only other major one that we have to consider is the big adductor that follows the adductor magnus on the inside of the leg. So this is a great example where you've eliminated a ton of other muscular options just by, again, looking at one additional perspective. So the takeaway from this is that when we're trying to look at 2D anatomy, right, we need to understand that if we are looking at a 2D representation, which can be incredibly helpful, right, for understanding function, that we need to be able to look at a multitude of two-dimensional perspectives and not just either one of these, because either one of these in isolation, and these are only two, again, I'll repeat, these are only two instances, gives you a very limited perspective on what that muscle can actually do. Another great example of this would be something like the pecs or something like the lats, which are both fan-shaped muscles that you can look at from one perspective, just let's say from behind the body or in front of the body, but you can also look at from the side and gain a totally different understanding, much like we did here, of that muscle, its function, and specifically what it will be more or less biased with in comparison to other muscles. So hopefully this distinction makes sense, and hopefully that you can start to apply it more from a principle-based standpoint across all the different muscles that you're studying and trying to learn how to apply. And if any of this was helpful, please let me know. And please let me know if you would want me to do it with any other muscle group, just to kind of gain a similar understanding across multiple contexts.